I'd been trusting Tom, and in that moment, there was something that I felt like he needed to share with me, and he hadn't, so.
She walked into the room and nobody recognized her. Not immediately. Not the way they usually do the double take, the whisper, the phone coming out. This time there was a pause, a genuine, unscripted pause where people who had covered her career for years looked at the same woman they had looked at dozens of times before and experienced something they could not immediately name. It was not the physical changes, though those were visible and we will get to them. It was something in the frequency. The specific, signature, unmistakable Darcey Silva frequency, that champagne and vulnerability energy, that performing and feeling simultaneously quality, that loud and magnetic and slightly chaotic current that has been her public signature for a decade, was simply not in the room. What was in the room instead was something quieter, something more particular. Something that felt, to everyone present, like a person rather than a brand. And the reaction from fans, from the media, from the community that has been her most devoted audience, was the most unexpected thing to happen in 35 episodes of watching this woman's life unfold in public. If that already has your attention, you are in the right place. Hit like, subscribe to the Tell-All Tapes, and do not go anywhere because what I am about to walk you through is the most complete character reversal I have documented in 5 years of covering this franchise, and it only gets more interesting from here. Now, let us start at the beginning, because context is everything, and the beginning of this story is a version of Darcey Silva that most of you know by heart. The aesthetic, the lashes, the dresses that are doing a significant amount of emotional labor, the champagne that appears in almost every public appearance as both prop and emotional signal. The vulnerability that arrives in waves is always genuine, always performed, always somehow both at the same time, which is its own kind of remarkable talent that almost nobody in this franchise has managed to replicate. The tears that are real and the delivery of the tears that are also real, but are also calibrated in real time to whatever the room or the camera appears to need from her. That version of Darcey has been consistent across seasons, across relationships, across the specific brand of heartbreak that has followed her from Jesse to Tom to Georgie and beyond. The version has been so consistent that it stopped being something she was doing and became something she simply was. The performance and the person became indistinguishable, not because she was, but because the performance had been running so long and so continuously that the distinction between the two had essentially disappeared. And that is the first thing you need to understand about what makes this moment different. The performance did not disappear because someone told her to stop performing. It did not disappear because a relationship ended, or a show got canceled, or a brand partnership fell through. It disappeared gradually, then visibly, then undeniably because of work. Specific, quiet, unglamorous work that happened off camera and showed up finally in a 3-minute panel answer at an industry event on a weekday afternoon. We are going to get to that panel. We are going to spend significant time on that panel. But first, you need to understand what the work was, why it was necessary, and why it took this long. The architecture of Darcey Silva's public persona was built in response to a specific kind of pain. That is not a controversial statement. It is something she has addressed publicly in fragments across multiple seasons. The abandonment wound, the specific terror of being left by someone you have restructured your entire identity around. The way that terror, when it is unaddressed, generates a behavioral loop that looks, from the outside, like chaos and poor decision-making and an inability to learn from experience. The loop is not chaos. The loop is extremely logical from the inside. External events generate emotional response. Emotional response becomes overwhelming because the underlying wound is unprocessed. Overwhelming emotion requires containment. Containment requires performance, a way of translating the interior into something manageable, something shareable, something that generates connection and validation and the temporary sensation of being seen. Validation temporarily fills the gap where the wound is. Gap reopens. New event, new loop, same architecture. That loop has run for a decade on camera. You have watched it. I have documented it. The audience has loved it, related to it, and occasionally, in the less generous moments of the comment section, mocked it. And none of that. Not the love, not the documentation, not the mockery addressed the architecture that was generating the loop in the first place. What addressed it was something that does not make for good television. Tuesday mornings in a clinical office, the kind of work that produces reports rather than drama, the kind of conversation that builds vocabulary for experiences that have been wordless for years, the kind of process that is slow and unglamorous and does not resolve in a 40-minute episode with a dramatic confrontation at the end. Darcey did that work over an extended period that I will not specify because the timeline is hers, not mine. And the evidence of that work showed up, quietly and then unmistakably, in the way she began to carry herself in professional settings. Less reactive, more specific, less designed for the widest possible audience, more calibrated to something internal that the audience had never been given access to before. The industry noticed first, and not in the way you would expect. The industry's initial reaction to the shift was not celebration. The industry's reaction was concern. Because the industry does not value authenticity in the abstract, the industry values the consistent delivery of a reliable product to an audience that has been trained to expect it. Darcey Silva, as a consistent brand, was commercially valuable in a specific and predictable way. The lashes, the champagne, the vulnerability loop, all of it was thumbnail-able, promotable, easy to sell to advertisers, and easy to deliver to an audience that understood exactly what they were getting. When the product began to shift, when the person inside the brand began to diverge from the brand in visible and undeniable ways, the industry's first instinct was not to celebrate the evolution. It was to worry about whether the evolved version was as commercially viable as the version being left behind. Here is what the industry missed, and what the more sophisticated observers in her professional community started noticing about 6 months before the panel moment. The audience that was coming to the new version of Darcey was different in character, not just in size. The old audience, deeply loyal, highly reactive, emotionally invested in the specific performance of vulnerability that had been her signature, was showing some disorientation, reduced engagement on certain content. Comments that expressed a specific kind of confusion, not hostility, exactly, but the uncertainty of someone who ordered a familiar dish and found something slightly different on the plate. That disorientation is measurable in engagement metrics, and the brand partnerships that had been built around the old version were watching those metrics and asking questions. At the same time, a different audience was arriving, slower to engage, more deliberate in their attention, less likely to comment in the heat of the moment, and more likely to watch something twice, send it to a friend, return to it a week later. Less reactive, more durable. The kind of audience that does not generate the immediate engagement spike that looks impressive in a weekly report, but does generate the long-term loyalty that actually builds sustainable careers. The financial picture was and is in transition, and transition periods in creator economics are when the most consequential decisions get made, because transition periods are when the short-term metrics look worst and the long-term trajectory is most clearly forming. Darcey is currently in the most important financial and professional moment of her career, and she is navigating it without the comfort of the performance that made her previous career predictable. She is building in real time, with real tools, on a real foundation, with the full knowledge that the transition is uncomfortable and the metrics do not yet reflect the destination. Now, the panel. The event was an industry panel discussion, not a promotional appearance, not a red carpet, not a format that gives the subject control over the narrative. The format was a moderator asking questions, and the subject answering them in front of a room of industry professionals who know the difference between a prepared talking point and an actually retrieved from the interior response. The moderator asked a version of a question that has been asked of Darcey Silva in various forms across the entire decade of her public career. About her experience, about her journey, about what she has learned. You know what the old answer looked like. Everybody who has followed this franchise knows what the old answer looked like. The pause that was itself a performance, the emotional swell that arrived on cue, the vocabulary of growth, the word journey doing more work than any single word should be required to do. The word blessed appearing somewhere in the middle, the specific architecture of the vulnerability performance that acknowledged pain without actually naming it, that gestured at transformation without actually describing it, that was emotionally resonant and informationally empty in a way that is a specific skill, and Darcey had mastered it. The audience expected a version of that answer. The room expected a version of that answer. The moderator's face, when something else began to emerge, was the first visible signal that something was different. The answer she gave was 3 minutes long. It was uninterrupted. It was specific in a way that the old vocabulary was never specific. She used clinical language not to perform sophistication, but because clinical language was the accurate language for what she was describing. She talked about behavioral patterns in a way that required someone to have had behavioral patterns named and described to them by a professional. She talked about the difference between emotional reactivity and emotional response, the difference between something that happens to you and something you choose in a way that requires someone to have spent real time with that distinction in a therapeutic context. She described a moment of recognition, a specific moment, not a general one that sounded like the kind of moment that gets written about in personal documentation, the kind of moment that gets flagged in a clinical report as significant, the kind of moment that people who have done real work talk about, with the specificity that distinguishes genuine insight from performed insight. The answer did not contain the word journey once. Let me say that again, because it matters more than it might appear to. A decade of public speaking, a decade of answering versions of this question in interviews, on reunions, in confessionals, and the word that has done more structural work in Darcey Silva's public vocabulary than any other word was simply absent, not replaced by a better word, replaced by actual sentences that described actual things that actually happened. The vocabulary of the performance was gone. What remained was vocabulary she had built herself, in private, over a period of real work, for the purpose of describing her own interior accurately rather than accessible. The panel audience industry professionals who have seen every version of this woman were silent in a way that silence is rarely silent. Not the polite silence of waiting for someone to finish. The present silence of people who are paying attention because something worth paying attention to is happening. 3 people in the room independently described the same sensation afterward. They said they felt like they were meeting her for the first time. Not because she was different, because they were finally being introduced to the person who had always been there underneath the performance that had made the introduction impossible. The clip was sent to this channel by 17 separate sources within 48 hours of the panel. It has been viewed, as of this recording, over 2 million times. The comments section is worth reading in full because it is doing something unusual. It is processing a genuine surprise, not the manufactured surprise of a dramatic reveal. The genuine surprise of encountering something real when you expected something performed. The comment that has been liked the most by a significant margin says simply, "I did not know she was this smart. She always was." That is the part that requires documentation, because it is the most important accountability note in this analysis. Intelligence was always present. The emotional precision was always present. The capacity for genuine self-reflection was always present. You can see traces of it if you go back through the archive, in unguarded moments, in split-second reactions before the performance layer recalibrated. The performance never had room for it. The performance was built to deliver a specific product to a specific audience, and that product did not include the parts of her that were complicated, or clinical, or quiet, or specific. The parts that required the audience to slow down and pay attention rather than react emotionally. Those parts were edited out not maliciously, not by anyone in particular, but by the aggregate weight of an audience that had been trained to expect a certain frequency and rewarded the delivery of that frequency with engagement. She learned what the audience rewarded. She delivered it. For a decade. And in the process, she delivered it so consistently that she almost lost track of the parts that the audience was not rewarding. The work she did, the Tuesday morning, clinical office, unglamorous and slow work, was partly the work of finding those parts again, of excavating the interior that the performance had been built on top of learning to trust that the authentic version of herself was worth offering to an audience that had been trained on the performed version. That trust was not instant. It was not the result of a single conversation or a single breakthrough moment. It was built incrementally, through the specific kind of repetition that therapy involves: saying the true thing, hearing that the true thing is acceptable, saying it again, finding more specific language for it, saying it again in a different context, discovering that the true thing survives contact with the outside world without the protection of performance around it. The panel was not the beginning of that process. It was the first public evidence that the process had reached a stage where the results were visible to people who were not looking for them. And here is the part that nobody wants to say directly, so I am going to say it directly because that is what this channel exists to do. The audience reaction to the panel, the disorientation, the uncertainty, the comments that express something that is not quite disappointment but is adjacent to it, is not Darcey's problem to solve. It is ours to examine. We built the expectations that are making this transition uncomfortable. A decade of watching the performing version, rewarding the performing version with engagement, making the performing version commercially necessary. That is an audience behavior, and it has consequences. When the person inside the performance decides to let the performance go, the audience that helped build the performance experiences something that functions like loss. The familiar thing is becoming less familiar. The reliable delivery of a specific emotional product is being replaced by something that requires more patience, more attention, more willingness to engage with complexity rather than emotion. And the portion of the audience that is not ready for that shift is not wrong to feel disoriented. They are experiencing a real change in a relationship they were invested in. But their disorientation is not a reason for Darcey to return to the performance. Their disorientation is information about the nature of the relationship that the performance created, and that information is worth sitting with. Because here is what the performance created, and this is the most honest thing in 35 episodes of this series. The performance created a relationship between Darcey and her audience that was warm and genuine and parasocial, and based on a version of her that was made partly for consumption. No, not dishonest. Made for consumption, calibrated to what the audience needed from her, adjusted in real time based on what the room or the camera appeared to reward. The relationship was real. The audience's love was real. The engagement was real. And the version of Darcey at the center of it was not, I will say that again, but constructed. Built for durability in a specific commercial environment. And the person underneath the construction is now, for the first time in a decade of public life, being offered to an audience without the construction around her. The real version is quieter, less immediately rewarding, more particular to her specific interior, rather than to the collective emotional needs of an audience of millions. It requires the audience to meet her where she is, rather than the other way around. And that reversal of the performer no longer calibrating to the audience, but the audience being asked to calibrate to the performer, is the shift that is generating the disorientation. It is also, and I want to be clear about this, the only version of this relationship that is sustainable for her. The performing version was running at a cost that was invisible in the engagement metrics and completely visible in her private life, in the loop of relationships and heartbreak and validation seeking that the series has documented. The authentic version costs something different. It costs audience comfort. It costs commercial predictability. It costs the warm, familiar frequency that the audience had come to rely on. But it does not cost her the thing that the performing version was costing her. It does not cost her access to herself. There is a specific kind of isolation that comes with becoming authentically yourself in public after a decade of performing a version of yourself, and it is the most counterintuitive isolation you will encounter in this analysis. Becoming real reduces the interior loneliness, the specific exhaustion of maintaining a gap between who you actually are and who you are presenting to the world. That gap takes energy to maintain, enormous energy. The energy that Darcey has been spending on real-time audience calibration and performance management, and the constant low-level work of being seen as the version rather than as herself, that energy is now available for something else. That is a genuine gain, and it is not a small one. But becoming real increases, at least temporarily, another kind of isolation. The social isolation of no longer being the version of yourself that your existing relationships were built around. The fans who loved the performing Darcey are in a different, more uncertain relationship with the real one. The brand partnerships that were built around the predictable version are in active renegotiation. The industry relationships that depended on knowing what you were getting from her are being rebuilt around something less predictable and more genuine. Every relationship in her professional ecosystem that was built on the performance is now in a period of recalibration. And recalibration periods are lonely. even when you know intellectually that you are recalibrating towards something better. Darcey is, by every observable indicator, aware of this. The panel answer was not the speech of someone who is unaware of the cost of what she is doing. It was the answer of someone who has assessed the cost, found it acceptable, and decided to pay it, which is the most grown-up thing I have seen from anyone in this franchise in 5 years of covering it. The specific language she used in the panel, and I am going to return to language, because language is evidence, included a phrase that stopped several people in the room and generated the longest pause in the 3-minute answer. She said, in reference to a previous relationship dynamic, that she had spent years mistaking familiarity for safety. Familiarity for safety. The specific precision of that distinction, not confusing love with obsession, not confusing attention with affection, but mistaking familiarity for safety, is clinical language that describes a specific psychological pattern. The pattern where a relationship feels safe, not because it is actually protective, but because it is known. Because the pain it produces is familiar pain. Because the uncertainty of something genuinely healthy feels more threatening than the certainty of something reliably harmful. That is a sophisticated and specific insight, and it requires real work to arrive at. It does not come from a conversation. It comes from a process. 2 million views. The most liked comment. I did not know she was this smart. She always was. The panel just finally had room for it. Here is where the analysis gets forward-looking, because this is the moment in any evolution where the most important decisions happen. The panel is not the destination. The panel is evidence of a direction. What Darcey does with that direction, whether she can sustain the authentic version under the commercial pressure to return to the performing one, whether she can build an audience around the real person rather than the constructed version, whether the metrics that are currently in transition will resolve in a direction that makes the authentic path financially viable as well as personally necessary, that is the actual story. And it is unfinished. The pressure to return to the performance will be real. It will come from brand partners who want the predictable version. It will come from the portion of the audience that expresses its disorientation loudly enough to register in the analytics. It will come from the specific seduction of the engagement spike, that immediate, measurable, dopamine-adjacent validation that the performance reliably generated, and that the authentic version, at least in the transition period, is not generating at the same volume. The pressure will be sophisticated, and it will be dressed in the language of care by people who want her to be successful, who want her audience to stay, who frame the return to the performance as the practical choice, the smart choice, the choice that protects what she has built. That framing is not entirely wrong, and it is not entirely honest. It is the framing of people who are invested in the product rather than the person. And Darcey is, for the first time in a decade, in a position to recognize the difference between those two kinds of investment. The 3-minute panel answer is the point of no return in a very specific sense. Not because it ended the performing version overnight, the transition is ongoing and the metrics are still shifting, but because it exists, because 2 million people watched it, because the comment section recognized something it had not seen before. Because industry professionals who have seen every version of her described, independently, the sensation of meeting her for the first time. You cannot say 3 minutes of true things. You cannot unoffer the interior to an audience of 2 million people and return to pretending the interior is inaccessible. The door has been opened. The question is whether she walks through it permanently or uses it as a temporary excursion before returning to the more comfortable side. Every piece of available evidence says she walks through it. The clinical work says she walks through it. The vocabulary she has built says she walks through it. The specific behavioral change is the absence of the calibration, the silence of the audience management machinery, the 3 uninterrupted minutes of actual self without the performance layer that says she walks through it. But watching is not the same as knowing, and knowing is not the same as the ongoing daily choice to remain on the authentic side of the door when the commercial pressure to return is real and sustained and dressed in the language of practicality. What I can tell you, with the confidence of 5 years covering this franchise and 35 episodes of this specific series, is that the person who showed up at that panel is the most interesting version of Darcey Silva that has ever appeared in public. Not the most entertaining, not the most immediately rewarding, the most interesting, the version that has been doing the work, the version that has been building the vocabulary, The version that, when asked a question she has been asked 100 times before, produced an answer that made a room full of industry professionals go quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something worth paying attention to is happening. She always had that in her. The performance just never had room for it. The performance is, now, finally, making room, and what she builds in that room, what she offers from that room, what she creates from that room, what she becomes when she is no longer spending the majority of her energy maintaining the gap between the performance and the person, is the question that the final 4 episodes of this series will pursue. Subscribe, because it is the only question left in this story that does not already have an answer. And the answer, when it arrives, is going to be worth having watched every episode to reach.